The old American West has been the stuff of movie legend ever since the silent film days, but for my money, it's never been bigger and better than in the 1950s. So let's talk about the top 10 Westerns from that decade. Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, everyone, where we are dusting off old movies. My name is Daniel, and we are going to be talking about those top 10 Westerns from the 1950s. Definitely one of my favorite genres. It's great for seeing the history of the US, of America, but also it's almost like a post-apocalyptic genre where it's people living in a world where there is some civilization, but very little, and they're in the process of building civilization. There's a lot of interesting conflict that comes out of that, but also because this was such a giant genre around this decade of the 1950s, so much of the best of Hollywood talent was going into these tense, thrilling stories, and I love them. So let's jump right in with number 10, which is Johnny Guitar from 1954. Joan Crawford plays Vienna, a local saloon boss whose old flame, Johnny Guitar, comes back into town. When they try to rekindle their bitter romance, a local outlaw robs a bank, and Vienna is at least partially blamed for it. Tensions in the town rise that lead to a tense standoff led by an angry, jealous woman named Emma. Now, this film was directed by Nicholas Ray, one of my favorite directors, and it's such a fascinating and unique Western because it's from the perspective of women. Sadly rare for this genre, and Joan Crawford is incredible as this lead character. It's a very intense and powerful performance as she is used to playing. And Sterling Hayden co-stars as Johnny Guitar, who's just one of the coolest actors, and he's insanely cool in this movie. I love watching him just kind of tear people apart through a few very calm words. It's a really beautiful looking movie. Even though there's a lot of location shooting, it has sort of an artificial look with a lot of gorgeous matte paintings and big extravagant sets and some really colorful costumes. It's a very tense, thrilling melodrama of a Western. It ends up coming in at the bottom of this list because I think it has a few pacing issues in the second half. While the first half is so incredible, you'd think it'd be near the top of the list. I do think the second half pacing gets a little bit off, and I do end up feeling the length, but it has to make this list because it is so unique and interesting, and one of the examples of 1950s Westerns I think everybody needs to see. At number 9, one of the biggest classics of the genre, and that is High Noon from 1952. Gary Cooper plays Marshall Kane, who's preparing for retirement from law enforcement when he gets married, but on his wedding day, he receives word that a vicious outlaw that he put behind bars has been released and is set to arrive back in town on the noon train. From there, Kane decides to stay and defend the town, prepare for the outlaw's incoming revenge, and unsuccessfully struggles to get anyone in the town to help him. Now, what makes High Noon work so well is that it's an incredibly tense, almost real-time Western in which we, the audience, are anticipating the threat of this incoming violence, and we're just getting angrier and angrier watching the weak people of this town not willing to stand up and help our hero. Gary Cooper is one of the biggest legends of the Western, and this is actually not the last time he's going to come up on this list. I find him to be great as very stoic and heroic figures, and he's excellent at that in this movie. One thing that holds the movie back a little bit for me is Grace Kelly as his fiancée. She's not quite believable in this very dark and gritty world, and she feels a bit mismatched with Gary Cooper. This movie was a bit controversial when it first came out because it was seen as an allegory for communism and the Red Scare going on in Hollywood. In fact, John Wayne turned it down for those very reasons, but it ended up being a giant classic of the genre. Gary Cooper won the Oscar for this movie, and it was one of the first 25 films entered into the Library of Congress for being historically significant. At number 8 is definitely a less well-known movie, but a giant classic to me, and that is Day of the Outlaw from 1959. This movie follows Robert Ryan as Blaze Sterrett, a local rancher who is having conflict with the people in the town for not letting cattle onto his land. He feels set up as the villain of the movie, and just when he's about to have a standoff with another local man who rides into town, but Burl Ives and his gang. And because these people, Burl Ives and his gang, are like the worst people in the world, absolute barbarians, Robert Ryan ends up being almost forced into the heroic role. The movie that follows is a brutally intense thriller in which Robert Ryan is struggling to keep this town together by any means necessary and keep the almost fatally wounded Burl Ives alive just so he can hold his men back from absolutely burning this town to the ground. This movie is so fun because it's so intense. It's got beautiful black and white photography in the snow. This is one of those rare examples of a snowy cowboy Western. And being that it's at the very end of the decade, 1959, it really hints where the genre is going to be going in the 60s, as things are going to get much darker, especially led by the Italians like Sergio Corbucci and Sergio Leone, as well as Sam Peckinpah. I would recommend Day of the Outlaw to anyone who wants to watch a Western that is very dark and very gritty, but for anyone who wants something a bit more fun and uplifting, it might not be the movie for you. At number 7 is Bend of the River from 1952. This is the entry in this list that represents the Anthony Mann and Jimmy Stewart collaborations, two men, a director and an actor, who made 5 Westerns together in the 1950s, and some of my very favorites in the entire genre. I love their whole run of collaborations, and I highly recommend all of them. This ended up being the one that I chose for my favorite and to represent on this list, and it represents something that I really enjoy about the Western, and then that's that it pulls conflict from how incredibly difficult everything about the Old West was. What Bend of the River is ultimately about is needing food. It's about homesteaders who have settled some land and are going to build a town and build civilization, and they need food. They bought some food from the local city, and the city now won't ship it because gold has been discovered and the city's economy has exploded. This movie explores two very interesting themes. On a grand scale, it explores the corrupting of the Old West, how some people had good intentions and wanted to build a home and build communities with their families and friends, and how some people only want to use this land to make money and will do it by any means necessary. That conflict I find very interesting, but the movie is also very explicitly about whether or not people can change, as Jimmy Stewart's character is an ex-outlaw gunfighter who is trying to redeem himself. This movie has a great cast, led by Jimmy Stewart, such as Julia Adams and Rock Hudson, and I think it is such a great, beautiful, fascinating Western, and it comes in at my number 7. My number 6 is William Wyler's The Big Country from 1958. This is starring Gregory Peck as retired wealthy sea captain James McKay, who arrives in the West to marry his fiancée, played by Carol Baker. McKay's strong and peaceful values are a mystery to the local ranchers, who take an immediate dislike to him. The local wealthy tycoon Major Henry Terrell, played by Burl Ives, is involved in a ruthless land war over watering rights for cattle. A tense fight for the land ensues, and possibly an entire change of direction for McKay. Ultimately, one of the best things about this movie is just Gregory Peck as this character of James McKay. He's so interesting because in most ways he is a perfect archetype for a Western hero, but in such an unconventional way. He's such a good person, but he's not our hero by being the biggest tough guy. In fact, there's a very interesting sequence where Charlton Heston, who plays a rare supporting role in this movie, challenges him to a fight in front of a bunch of people. James McKay refuses. He won't do it. Everybody calls him a coward. And then later that night, while everyone else is asleep, he gets Charlton Heston out of bed. They go outside and they have that fight. It just shows how he's not necessarily afraid to back down from anything, but he doesn't want to do anything for fame or glory. He's just about doing the right thing, no matter what it costs, and without anybody actually watching. The character study of him is so fascinating as his goodness comes into conflict with the corruption around him. The movie's 2.5 hours, which I recommend might be a barrier to some people, but I'm not always the biggest fan of really long movies. And when I watched it, I almost didn't even want it to end. I thought it was so engaging. I loved it the entire way through. My number 5 might actually be the darkest movie on this list, and that is Man of the West from 1958. Former outlaw Link Jones, played by Gary Cooper, travels to Crosscut, Texas to catch a train to Fort Worth to hire the town's first school teacher. When his train stops for refueling on the way, they are attacked by armed robbers, but the train pulls away, leaving behind Jones, as well as a fast-talking gambler and a saloon singer. They eventually reach a farmhouse where Jones once lived, and they find the men who robbed the train and their leader, played by Lee J. Cobb, who, it turns out, is Jones's old gang, and they want him to return to his own criminal ways and rejoin. Now, he has no interest in doing so, and he has to find a way out for himself and his 2 companions, knowing the gang are untrustworthy killers. Man of the West, even at this early stage, feels a lot like a revisionist Western, which is a Western that darkly subverts the normal tropes of the genre. This is my personal favorite Anthony Mann Western, that guy I just talked about who made a lot of movies with Jimmy Stewart, and my favorite Gary Cooper Western. This movie is so dark and savage, and it's about exploring how our hero of the movie used to be just as evil and savage as these killers that they are trying to fight. It's a movie all about whether or not someone can change and if they even deserve a redemption story, even if they can. Lee J. Cobb steals the entire movie as the villain, a man who is not much older than Gary Cooper, but plays much older and does it very convincingly in a very sinister way. This movie is special to me because it was the first 1950s Western I watched that really turned me around on the genre. I got really into spaghetti Westerns, Italian Westerns first, for how dark they were. And this was the movie that showed me that 1950s Westerns can do that too, and we're doing it first. At number 4 is the earliest movie on this list, and that is The Gunfighter from 1950. The second appearance of Gregory Peck on this list. Peck plays notorious fastest gun in the West, Johnny Ringo, who rides into town to find his long-lost wife, who no longer wants to see him. He hasn't come looking for trouble, but trouble finds him around every corner as little pipsqueaks, as he calls them, always try to fight him for the hard-won title. This is such a fascinating example of a Western because the fastest gun in the West is such an important archetype to the genre, and this movie is all about how being the fastest gun in the West really, really sucks. This movie is really a psychological study about Gregory Peck's character, the most world-weary hero as he really is, because he really just wants peace. He wants to leave his criminal ways. He wants to find a new life. There's a real theme of redemption of gunfighters on this list, a big part of the genre, especially in the 1950s. And he just wants to leave that life behind, but he's too famous. Everybody knows him, and everybody wants that title of the fastest gun in the West. He's always coming across young guys who want to prove themselves, and the best way they can prove themselves is to kill him, and that leaves him no choice but to kill them. And once he's done that, he's got to leave town, because even if the sheriff finds it to be a free fight, the murdered guy's family is going to come after him. There are multiple sources of brutal tension in this movie for a very effective thriller. The movie is gorgeously photographed in black and white with a 1:37 aspect ratio that gives the movie a very tall and beautiful look. I really can't recommend The Gunfighter enough. It is one of the most interesting examples of what a Western can be. Before I go into the top 3, let me just say thank you very much for watching this video, and please give a like, as it really does help the algorithm of YouTube for people to be able to find my channel. And if you do like a YouTube channel that focuses on old movies, on classic cinema such as these, give a subscribe. Got more fun videos and more top 10s coming on the way very soon. My number 3 is a movie that I would wager is on number 1 for most people. And it's not that I disagree with you. I think it's amazing. They're just 2 movies I enjoy a little bit more. So my number 3 is John Ford's The Searchers from 1956. The Searchers opens up with a homesteading family as their uncle Ethan comes back from the Civil War, and a Comanche tribe brutally attacks them, kills most of the family, but steals 2 of the daughters. And the movie follows John Wade's character as well as a young man who the family had taken in, played by Jeffrey Hunter, as they go out searching to find these 2 young girls. The Searchers is such a fascinating movie for me in how well it works, because it's such a masterful mix of tones. Usually when a Western is dark, like a few movies we talked about, it's just that, it's dark. The Searchers is very dark, very mean, almost a vile movie in so many ways. But it's also fun to watch. It's funny, it's beautifully photographed, it is romantic at times. It's really a perfect night at the movies in so many ways. One of the most gorgeous Westerns I've ever seen, with so many beautiful things to offer, and it is such a mean and violent movie. I wonder if it's one of the most accurate movies on this list for how the Old West was, and that it was a terrible place, but people also found moments of happiness together. So it doesn't really focus on either 2 of those aspects of the Old West. It's this crazy mix. John Wayne gives the finest performance that he ever gave as this fascinating character of Ethan. He's such a dark and miserable racist character against all Native Americans. And really, he's not so much going out to save these 2 young girls like Jeffrey Hunter is. He's going out to kill them, and he's going out because of revenge. And it's really about how revenge can destroy a person and ruin their lives. It's got one of the greatest endings of all time that so many movies have taken, in which even when you do the right thing and you save civilization, sometimes you're such a broken person and the process has rotted you away so much that you can't even really be a part of it. There's a beautiful quote in this movie that I think sums it up so well, and that's, "Someday this country is going to be a fine place to be. Maybe it needs our bones in the ground before that time can come. My number 2 is a much smaller movie and much more minor classic than The Searchers, but I can't deny how much fun I have watching it and how many times I've rewatched it. And that is The Tall T from 1957, directed by Bud Boetticher and starring Randolph Scott. Now, much like Jimmy Stewart and Anthony Mann, Boetticher and Scott were two collaborators that made a bunch of westerns together in the 1950s, and it's one of my favorite runs in the genre. I love these movies so much, but there's no question for me that The Tall T is my favorite. It's a very short, tight, and effective little thriller with a simple premise. It's about a former ranch foreman, played by Randolph Scott, who is kidnapped along with a newly wedded woman who is the daughter of the richest man in the state, and they're held for ransom by 3 outlaws. The heart of the movie is the relationship between Pat, played by Randolph Scott, and Frank, the leader of this gang, played by Richard Boone. I love stories about a hero and villain who are two sides of the same coin, and that totally describes these two guys, very similar in so many ways, but one who has chosen a dark path and one has not. It's so interesting watching how the outlaw Frank is developing this great respect for Pat, and he really respects what a good guy he is and what a tough man he is. That's so much of what these Bud Boetticher westerns are about. They involve so much great dialogue of men pontificating about what manhood is and what it really means to be a man. So many interesting conversations going on like that. But all the way, it's just this very tight, intense, short little movie that's so effective, so beautiful to look at. It also has Henry Silva, a very early performance from Henry Silva as the most ruthless member of the gang. But when I first set out to make this list, there was absolutely no question in my mind what my number 1 would be. I never wavered from that. And that is Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo from 1959. Sheriff John T. Chance, once again starring John Wayne, arrests a murderer who has a powerful rancher for a brother who will do anything necessary to get him out. Chance, his elderly deputy Stumpy, played by Walter Brennan, and the town drunk dude, played by Dean Martin, prepare for the impending jailbreak, and Chance romances a beautiful woman named Feathers, played by Angie Dickinson. Rio Bravo is 2.5 hours of people hanging out. It is the ultimate hangout movie in the best possible way. So much of the movie is people holed up in one location, just waiting for some violence to happen. But unlike High Noon, which is a very tense experience of that, Rio Bravo is one of the most fun movies ever made. John Wayne is great in this movie. I know it's kind of cool to hate John Wayne these days. I can't get on board with that. I think he was a very powerful movie star presence. So he is great in this movie, but he enjoys being surrounded by two of the greatest supporting performances in the entire genre, that of Dean Martin as Dude and Angie Dickinson as Feathers. Dean Martin is absolutely the heart of this movie. Watching this guy who used to be a great deputy for Sheriff John T. Chance, but who really went downhill when he became a pretty crippled alcoholic. And this movie involves him trying to build himself back up from that, trying to prove himself, trying to be more than just the town drunk that he had been for so long. It's a really phenomenal performance from an actor who didn't get the chance to do something like this very often, was mostly in musical comedies. That's one thing that makes the movie so special. But Angie Dickinson, man, she's probably my favorite part of the movie, the most fun to watch. She basically beats John Wayne into submission, into being a romantic lead. She's like, I've decided we're going to have a romance, so whether you like it or not, that's going to happen. And she's a perfect Hawksian female lead. Howard Hawks had a tendency to make female leads like this. She's very strong and powerful, and she knows what she wants, and she goes after it so hard, and John Wayne's just kind of helpless to stop her. This movie is all about dialogue, watching Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson, who's also in this movie, sing songs. There's a great just guitar singing sequence with this movie has great songs like My Rifle, My Pony and Me, and the title song of Rio Bravo. It ends up becoming a great siege movie, but most of it is just hanging out. And if you deny this movie being such a classic, it's one of John Carpenter's favorite movies and one of his inspirations. In fact, I'd say the inspiration for Assault on Precinct 13. So that's it, my top 10 1950s Westerns. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite 1950s Westerns are. I would love to talk about this genre with you guys, so let's continue the conversation down in the comments. Please subscribe if you like more videos like this, and give a like if you enjoyed it. I've also got a link to a playlist down below of my other top 10 videos, including my top 10 noir films, my top 10 Robin Hood movies, and more are on the way, so I'll see you then.